Goedenavond, mijn naam is Jana Griffith. Vandaag zijn we bijeengekomen om een zeer interessante man te interviewen. Hij is onbekend bij velen, maar dit is zeer onterecht. Het betreft de veteraan uit de burgerrechtenbeweging, Dr. Oba T'Shaka. We zullen hem vandaag namens Grapevine een aantal interessante vragen voorleggen. Hopelijk kunnen we er wat van leren. Ik ben benieuwd. Jij ook? Mr. Oba T'Shaka, welcome. And thank you for making time for us.
Glad to have a chance to speak with you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very grateful to given this opportunity. Can you tell me something about yourself to start? Who is Dr. Oba T'Shaka?
Oba T'Shaka, in the former incarnation, Bill Bradley. I'm a warrior scholar and sometimes a scholar warrior. It depends on which is getting more emphasis, the scholarship or the organizing. And I'm a spiritual scholar warrior. So my background involves being involved in the Black freedom movement in the 1960s through the present, starting in the Congress of Racial Equality, San Francisco chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, where I served as chair from 1963 to 1965. I'm a founder of a group called the Pan-African People's Organization, which was an extension, a continuation of Black Power phase of the Congress of Racial Equality. Built schools and served food for the hungry and sent work teams to Tanzania and took part in the 6th Pan-African Congress. I'm a co-founder of the National Black United Front, which is a national organization, self-reliant, and taking up various issues, including African-centered education, reparations, and playing a role in the Million Man March, where I was privileged to speak. I'm also a founder of a group called the Pan-African Secretariat that operated between 1970 and 1980. I'm also a scholar and an author of a number of books and a professor, but basically a freedom fighter.
A freedom fighter with a lot of activities.
Yeah.
What were your most proudest achievements?
Probably my most proudest achievement would be my participation in the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, because that was my baptism into struggle, and of all the organizing that I did, I think the best organizing we did was in the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. So that was a movement that addressed economic apartheid, the denial of jobs for blacks and people of color in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and throughout the state of California. And it was the only movement in the Black freedom movement that tackled across the board economic apartheid successfully, defeating all arms of the white power structure, which was the economic elite. We took on the most powerful corporations in the world and beat them on the issue of jobs for blacks and people of color. We had an extremely good team of organizers, very smart and very dedicated people. And I think one of the things I'm really proud of is that that movement did not compromise, and none of us profited from that movement. It was an unspoken understanding that the jobs that we gained for our people and people of color were not for us, and we had plenty of people in our organization that were either unemployed or underemployed. But that wasn't even something we had to discuss. The love for the people was so strong that it was never thought that we would profit from the movement. And so it was my baptism into struggle and into consciousness. And so it was, of all of my involvements in struggle, the most important.
And what inspired you to do all of this? Because
a lot of things. Some things weren't conscious. My father is from Alexandria, Louisiana, and he worked on a plantation in Orange, Texas, and it was just like slavery, called sharecropping, where black people would pick cotton and at the end of the year get nothing. My father was always a fighter, and a physical fighter and a mental fighter, and he fought against the Ku Klux Klan and beat the owner of the plantation's son half to death when he insulted him with the N-word. And so my father was a fighter, and I didn't consciously join the movement because he was a fighter, but that was in me. I had that example. The other thing was the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott really provided an example where Africans in the United States stood up against political apartheid, which was the new slavery that took over at the end of slavery in the United States during the post-Reconstruction period. So blacks in Montgomery stood up and defeated political apartheid. And so for me, I wasn't that conscious politically, but I could see the power of our people, and I wanted to be a part of that movement. The other thing was the Cuban Revolution. I was a student at San Francisco State University, and I was in a debating class, and I debated on the pro of the Cuban Revolution. I was not a revolutionary at that point, but I identified with it because I could see that it was about justice for the oppressed people of Cuba, who were mostly black. When I won the debate, I then challenged my debate professor to a debate, and he refused to debate me. So that was a part of it. But the biggest thing was my mother's best friend. Her name was Ella Hutch. Ella Hutch was the founder of the San Francisco chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality. And she was the mother of the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, my mother's best friend. And she told me that I should go to a CORE meeting. And I didn't know what CORE was. And so I went to this meeting, and I discovered that something was going on that was very important. And that was the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. So Ella Hutch was a major influence in introducing me to the movement.
Yes.
The main influence was in 1963, I was elected chair of San Francisco CORE and was in the middle of leading a jobs campaign. And I was having a lunch at a place called Virginia's Restaurant, which was a black-owned restaurant in the Fillmore. The Fillmore was like the Harlem of the West Coast. It was the most conscious black community on the West Coast. And Virginia's was a restaurant owned by a black woman from Louisiana named Virginia. She fed us free meals because we were full-time organizers. We organized 18, 19 hours a day, no pay. And so the community took care of us. But it was in the context of a conversation that I had with a brother who was still a very good friend of mine, Norman Brown, that I underwent an awakening. Norman Brown was a person who came from an all-black community in Florida that Zora Neale Hurston, a great African-American scholar, came from. It was the first all-black city organized by blacks in the United States. Norman Brown was a cab driver. He's a little guy. He's 2 years older than me. And high school education, very smart, and spent a lot of time in New York. And as we were eating, Norman began to explain how the system worked. I was a government major. I was in my second year of law school. I knew how the government worked. My favorite word at that time was I know. It explained to me how the government worked, and I realized I had been brainwashed, that my education had been a miseducation. I had been told this was a democratic government, but I had been negotiating with and kicking the behinds, that means fighting, the economic power structure. And so what Norman said hit me between the eyes, but it also hit me at my level. And he explained that the corporations ran this country, not the people. Now, this is no big insight for people today, but in the 1960s, this was a fairly big insight. And so This caused me to realize, number one, I had an oh shit moment. Oh shit. I knew I was in trouble. And I said to him, I know it. And if I believed that America was a democracy, what else did I believe that was wrong? And so then I instantly knew I was in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know my enemy. I'm fighting the biggest economic forces in the country. I didn't know my enemy, which also meant I didn't know myself. And so that was the beginning of an awakening. And that meant I knew then I had to throw out most of the miseducation I had received and re-educate myself. So that was the most important experience. I call that the reconstruction of the black mind. Amilcar Cabral, the greatest leader in the 20th century, leader of the revolution in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, called it mental conversion. And when we do the workshop in Rotterdam, that will be a key part of setting up leadership training. Is if your mind isn't wrapped on right, then it doesn't matter what kind of leadership skills you have, you'll be leading people in the wrong direction. So that was the most important experience of my life, because it was my first experience of mental freedom. It wasn't full mental freedom, but it was the beginning. Malcolm X had a similar experience. And those blacks in the Black Liberation Movement or the African Liberation Movement around the world that experienced that needed to experience that, then that could lead to profound changes. Those that did not, if they were leading movements, that could put those movements in trouble. So that was the most important experience of my life.
That's
I
where
began
it started.
to wake.
That's where the fire inside ignited.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The passion. Yeah.
What I hear a lot of organization. It's a very important thing to be able to organize as a leader. You also say you need to be free. Your mind needs to be free, because when you get educated, you get to learn what they want you to know.
Right.
But
And that's called miseducation.
yes, and besides that, what makes a good leader?
Well, I think what makes a good leader is a follower, because leading is following. And most of us that joined the movement in the 60s, I think many of our people who have taken part in liberation movements historically, most did not join a movement to be a leader. Most joined the movement to make a contribution. And in my case, I joined the movement as a soldier. I saw myself as a foot soldier. And I had been in the Marine Reserves. In my brainwashed days, I was a machine gunner. I was the best Marine. I'm the best. Whatever I do, I try and be the best. I was a Negro then, not awake. But the point is, I came in as a soldier, and I assumed that our leaders had the answers. And that proved to be only partially true. So I think that the first thing is leading is following. And whether you assume leadership or not, it involves following the will of the people, the just will, not just any will, but the just will of the people. So I think that that's a key requirement in leadership. Another is respect for the people, because essentially liberation movement comes out of a people's culture, that you have to respect the people's culture. And I think the leadership that gets in trouble is the leadership that thinks that they know more than the people. And very often, because they've been westernized and miseducated, not that everything is wrong with Western education. There are some positive aspects. So that I think that you've got to respect the people and the people's culture, because that's where the wisdom is. No movement takes place unless the people decide to move. And anytime you see leaders emerging, they're just emerging out of a people's movement. The power is in the people. So I think that respecting the culture is extremely important. I think that listening, leading and organizing are linked. In the United States, there's sometimes a distinction between organizers, and leaders. In the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they considered themselves organizers, and they were helping to develop the people's leadership. So they made a distinction between an organizer and a leader. In the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, leaders and organizers were usually the same because we lived in that community and we were a basic part of the organizing in that community. So listening is very important. And then I think that in the best of African American leadership traditions, leaders are mouthpieces of the people's just will. So leaders should be able to help develop a consensus process, because the best of African and African American leadership systems come out of African democratic traditions, and they're not majority vote traditions, they're consensus traditions. And that takes patience. To develop a consensus takes patience. People will usually recognize what's good, but when everybody has a say-so in a process, then when a decision is reached, there's not going to be a group of people trying to pull that decision down. And my view always has been that we're all capable of making mistakes. And so the best way to minimize mistakes is to get everybody's ideas on the table. So, I think that that's part of good leadership. Part of leadership is you got to live with the people and be around the people and constantly be interacting with your people on all levels, class-wise, socially, educationally, all levels, religiously, politically. You can't limit yourself to one group or one clique. You become isolated. So it's a variety of qualities. Different people bring different qualities to leadership. And so it also depends on the talents of the people involved when it comes to leadership.
All right. And do you think it's nowadays it's hard to how do you say it, get to organize the people, to get people together and to fight for a cause?
Yeah, it's hard. It's always hard because you're facing a system of oppression, and in each area it's slightly different. In the United States, it's been particularly hard since the post-1968 period, because we've been hit with globalization that have taken good-paying jobs out of black communities. Globally, that same thing has occurred. In Africa, it's been through structural adjustment, and in the Caribbean and South America, the same thing, where policies of international corporations have been imposed on countries, largely because of weak leadership, but also because these countries themselves have been vulnerable. Places like Jamaica, where you had good leadership like Michael Manley, he faced the opposition of the West that wanted to make the Jamaican economy subordinate to the West. And today, Jamaica is in bad shape economically. In the United States, as these globalization policies took place, good-paying jobs left the country, and with it, then it meant that black men and black women did not have the kind of jobs, if you have a high school education or less, that could support a family. So these things weaken families. And with the post-60s period, the intelligence agencies decided to put drugs in the black community as a way of separating the youth from the struggle. And so then violence becomes a key part of the drug culture. And I think the most difficult problem that's posed by the forces that have hit African communities globally is that as these forces hit down deep and affect families and communities, then it creates a situation that I call a choice between two cultures, where communities are put in the unconscious position of choosing between a death culture. In the United States, it becomes extremely strong with the drug culture, where a lot of young people are being murdered by a handful of gangsters and by the police. But the police have always been doing the killing. But recently, with the injection of the drug culture, then you see that culture coming in with a small number of black youth And so death becomes a reality. And so life becomes uncertain. And so what we have is a choice between two cultures where on the one hand we have to choose between a rich culture that our people have recreated in the diaspora, that our people have in Africa, and this Euro-American culture that is heavily based on violence as one point. When families are weakened, then it reaches a point where it's hard for people to maintain viable two-parent relationships. This is especially true in the United States, where only 34% of our households have a husband and wife in it, whereas up to 1968, from 1900, 75% of our households had a husband and wife in it. So now we have a choice between a family culture and no family culture, or at least no two-parent family culture. And with drugs hitting black communities, it becomes extremely hard because then a wedge is driven between the young and the old, so there's a weakening of respect between the young and the old. And this is happening in Africa too. So this makes it harder to organize. But what's interesting is, in these complex circumstances, because our culture is very rich and strong, our people prove adaptable to the situation. In the U.S., I think the best example right now is Black Lives Matter. I think that the young people are doing an extremely good job of creating a movement where they are not centered on one leader. They call their movement leaderful, full of leaders. And that's exactly what you need to defeat a system that will try and find a leader and knock it off, kill it. And this movement has proven to be very resilient. A lot of young brothers and sisters, especially sisters. And they've been very good at bottling air. I call this bottling air. In other words, how do you take these movements across the U.S. and create some kind of unity? And they've done it through hashtagging it, Black Lives Matter. And so now they're up in the face of the Republicans and the Democrats. But the culture is strong enough wherever we are in the African world that we can respond to these difficult circumstances.
Do you think there's a distinguished way of organizing black people?
Amilcar Cabral made this point that liberation movements are acts of culture. And he said most liberation movements are not conscious of how the culture influences the movement. And I would say that was especially true in the 60s. We were not conscious of how the culture was influencing us, but we were acting on our culture. And I think this is true throughout most areas of the world, not just with African people. I think it's true with people in general, except for the most obvious things people are aware of. In China, they know that Mao Zedong was the emperor. And in the U.S., we knew that the black church had some impact on our movements. But we generally weren't conscious of the fact, for example, that African movements for liberation in the United States almost always kicked off on the spur of the moment. There's a slave narrative where a slave was asked, how did they recreate the culture? He said, we would think of something from Africa and we would come up with it on the spur of the moment, meaning that's called improvisation. And so, or hip hoppers call it freestyling. That's always the way our movements start. So the one thing black people cannot predict is what black people are going to do. That's the first thing to understand. And if we can't predict it, neither can they. And so the Montgomery bus boycott was on the spur of the moment. It was based on, as Dizzy Gillespie calls it, spontaneous organization. That's improvisation or freestyling. It was spontaneous. Rosa Parks said, I'm not giving up my seat. But it was organized. E.D. Nixon, who had been in charge of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, had been waiting for this to happen. Rosa Parks had been his secretary. He didn't know it would be her. So the point is, improvisation has got planning in it because you can't play a good musical instrument unless you practiced it. You cannot really organize a movement unless you've got something that you're organizing off of, and the people in Montgomery had been waiting for this. The same thing with Black Lives Matter. It was Spontaneous organization. The people in Ferguson hung in there for months, and then this spread like wildfire. So this is one feature of our culture that is expressed in our movements. Another feature is we're spirit-based people. We're a people that believes that the Spirit of God is within each one of us. And whereas with Christianity, for example, Western Christianity, it is tended to keep people in a position where they're under control. And they're used in wars, religious wars, or political wars. But for black people, I don't care what you call our religion, spirit is at the heart of what moves us, and it is an inspirational force that inspires us to take action. King, in the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott, was fearful. He didn't want to be a leader, which was a good sign. He wasn't seeking office. And two, he had some fear. And he sat in his kitchen one evening and he said, God spoke to him. And God told him, Martin, stand up for your people. And he said ever since then, he didn't have fear. In Mississippi, when black people were moving to organize, that's the worst place in the United States to be organizing against white supremacy or white race, the most vicious place.
Yes, it is.
Grandmother and great-grandmother both came from Mississippi. Black people said what inspired them, and these were a handful that went up against segregation. They said what inspired them was the Spirit told them to, and it was friends and family. The student sit-ins that spread across the South in 1960 had 55,000 students spontaneously organizing. One of the key reasons that movement spread was extended family networks. The extended family is an African institution carried from Africa into the Caribbean, South America, United States, and in Europe, where you not only have family members who are blood kin, but, you've got play family members. You've got sisters and brothers who are not blood relationship to you that are just like family. And so these are ways in which we organize. King made this comment that he didn't start the Montgomery bus boycott, but when they called on him, he stepped forward as a spokesperson for the people. That, again, is a part of our democratic leadership tradition. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was based on this group-centered leadership tradition. One of the most important features in our leadership tradition is this. It is hard to get black people together anywhere. Very, very hard. One reason is we cannot be told what to do. We all have to have our say-so if we're going to be a part of something. That's the way it is. But once we decide to do something, we stand as a unit. And so in Montgomery, you had 97% of black people supporting that boycott. This Black Lives Matter movement has broad support. When Barack Obama ran for president, 97% of black people supported him. 97% of white people have never agreed on anything in the United States or in the world. If you know the history of Europe, you know there's a history of blood and war. And there's been all kinds of disagreement and hatred among Europeans towards each other. So race consciousness is a key feature of this culture. Garvey could have never got his movement off the ground without this race consciousness. I spoke in Jamaica 2 years ago. 1 million people heard the speech on Garvey. I put more time into this speech than any speech because Garvey was my first master. I studied under Garvey. Even though he was dead, it was an indirect apprenticeship. One of the things I found out was that Garvey, a lot of credit has been given to Garvey to waking black people up, but what most people don't know is it's black people that woke Garvey up. Garvey came to the United States supporting King George's war. It's when he came in contact with blacks in the U.S. who had come back from World War I and who were angry at being used when they faced bloody summers where they were being shot at and they shot back in Chicago and other places. It was this anti-war, race-conscious sentiment of black people that woke Garvey up and made him anti-war. So Garvey, in fact, was converted by the masses of blacks in this country, and then he also helped convert them. That's the process of how leading is followed. So there are a lot of features in our culture that are really key to how we organize. It doesn't mean we always organize this way. We see in Africa, many African leaders today are not following African culture, and Africa's in trouble. They steal right and left. In fact, they steal so much there's nothing left. They don't just steal a little, they steal everything. Okay? And that's because in their miseducation, they have been taught this principle of greed. And then they've also been taught this principle of power. So they get some guns from the West, and so they can then force their people into submission. That's not African leadership. That is a brainwashed, miseducated leadership. So it all depends on whether we decide to return to the source and draw from the best of our people's culture. But when we do, we get the best results.
Are you familiar with the Black Pete discussion here in the Netherlands?
Yeah, the comparable Black Pete tradition in the United States would be the blackface that comes out of the end of slavery, what they call the minstrel thing, where whites would paint themselves in black and then do stereotyped performances of blacks that had nothing to do with black reality. And then when blacks wanted to perform, they often had to paint their faces black as well. But also there were little images like Little Black Sambo, which was an image of a black boy with big lips, very dark complexion, exaggerated features, eating a watermelon. And I recall in my first grade class, the only teacher I have whose name I remember, because all my teachers were white, this one was a Chinese American. Her name was Miss Chan. And she gave us the assignment of Little Black Sambo. And I refused to do it. And I went home and told my father.
And he was proud.
And my father came to school and asked her, how could you, a yellow person, teach a black person to hate themselves? And she said, I didn't know. And to this day, I have to admit, I have trouble with watermelon because of association with Black Sambo. But the point is, what I didn't know is, among the Fulani, Sambo means brave warrior. I didn't know that, you know? And many blacks on the plantation would pretend to be the Sambo of the whites, while they were actually the Sambo of the blacks, and they were preparing insurrection. So there's another side to this, you know? But they weren't in blackface. They were just pretending to go along with the system while they were organizing and planning revolts against it.
All right. Here in the Netherlands, we've been trying to get rid of the Black Pete. And you see a lot of black people as well, along with the people of the Netherlands, Dutch people. They think it isn't important.
I think that in the case of black people, part of it may be that it may well be a generational divide, that you may have some older people who want to believe that the Dutch are well-intentioned in what they're doing and don't want to believe that this is racism. I can't believe that all older blacks feel that way. There have to be those that know better.
There are enough, of course, who don't feel that way. Luckily, there are enough of people who will acknowledge it as a problem and who are willing to speak their mind. So that's a good thing. Always look at the positive, of course. But it's hard to come across people who kind of like try to break down your war.
Mm-hmm. You know, people have to think for themselves and see the world through their own eyes. And in this case, understand what a negative stereotype means. Because when you create a negative image of something that's black, something that's African, or if you take the negative image of Africa itself, it is designed to internalize self-hatred.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to understand that these negative images are dangerous because in creating a lie about the history of African people, the image of African people, it justifies a lot of things that whites will do. And some of those can be physical and violent. And some of them can be psychological and mentally harmful, especially to youth, especially to young people. So, we have to understand that this is not some innocent image. This comes out of hundreds of years of enslavement, colonization, and oppression. And the people who are carrying out these images can act like it's all right, but if we put the shoe on the other foot and we created a white Pete, and created the stereotypes of whites, see what their reaction would be. In a minute, they would go crazy. And so we need to understand that those are harmful and negative, you know what I mean? And it's not truthful. Anything that's false has to be rejected. So
And what would you say?
it's a part of mental freedom. Some people may know that these are bad images and may be afraid to say anything about them. So that may also be a part of the response. But the worst part is for those that don't think it's a problem. That's the problem.
Yes,
That's
it is.
the big
They
problem.
need to wake up. But what is your message to inspire black activists?
Well, I think that it's to understand that the condition of our people has to change and that we have to empower our people, and that the most important thing is we have to know who we are as a people. We have to know our history and our culture. And we have to understand that whatever our particular condition is, we have to care about the most oppressed among our people. And those who are impoverished and those who are oppressed, that has to be our first concern. And so, I think that we have to understand that we're a strong people. I'm reading a book on Suriname. And this book is called The Narrative of an Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname. Have you read that? Have you read that?
No, but Stedman.
Tedman.
Yeah.
In this book, this is a Dutch captain who's a part of the army sent to try and repress the slave insurrections, the successful slave insurrections. And he makes this observation. He said, the black people of Suriname come from societies where they believe in God. And then he said, and they're unbreakable. And that's not just true of Suriname. That's true of Africans across the Western Hemisphere. They came out of slavery unbreakable. And they're giving examples during the enslavement in Suriname. There was one where a 6'4" warrior is about to be thrown on a rack where they would break every bone in your body.
Yeah.
Horrible, brother. And he said, the jaguar in the jungle is afraid of me. And he threw himself on the rack. They broke every bone in his body, didn't utter a cry. And that's the spirit of our people. And we often miss this, especially in the States. There's this myth that they broke our people. How could they? Because how could we come out of enslavement and build so much in such a short period of time, whereas in the Caribbean and South America, you had land. How could we do this? These are the strongest people we've had. As Zora Neale Hurston said, those who were closest to slavery were closest to Africa. And so they came out with strong spirit, and they came out with their humanity intact, scarred by slavery. No doubt, scarred. I'm not going to romanticize this. Rough condition. But they came out a humane people. Carter G. Woodson observed of Africans coming out of slavery, the author of Miseducation of the Negro. He said that they were humane to a fault. He said if you took the average black person and it was his last quarter, he would give it to you to help. That has been at the soul of our people, this humanism that some of us put down and say it makes us weak. How could it be weak to be humane? So what I think is what from this mighty culture, as Du Bois said, it's in the souls of black folks. Draw from it and use it as an inspiration for struggle, for organizing, and for empowerment. And Africans in the West, in Europe, we're in a strategic position, in the United States, strategic position. Need to use that strategic position,
Yes.
and we need to work with each other.
How come you're so interested in hip hop?
Not all people my age, not people by age are interested in hip hop. One reason is hip hop is an expression of African American culture. In fact, hip hop is urban blues.
Mm-hmm.
And blues is the foundation of the musical culture of Africa. In fact, it comes from the spirituals. And so when the hip hoppers come along in the Bronx, and Kool Herc and others come along, African Bambaataa, and they begin to improvise through turntable, through rapping, and through graffiti, and through breakdance, and they begin to improvise this art form. It is simply a continuation of James Brown, who said, I'm the one. And they drew from the one of James Brown. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. They drew from the spirit of Malcolm X, the early hip-hoppers. And they drew from masters who helped shape them. Now too many hip-hoppers who are corporate, they only draw from dead presidents, Lil Wayne and his crazy stuff. You know what I mean? Who can put down somebody like Rosa Parks, which is shameful and disgraceful. So there is the underground of Dead Prez, Public Enemy, and others, and then there's this corporate hip hop, which is not hip hop at all.
It's not inspiring or uplifting in any form.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of hip hoppers are the ones that have some of the most relevant things to say now on the culture. And poetry is a part of our culture. Every part of our culture is poetic. If a brother really wants to have a relationship with a sister, poetry. You know what I mean? He needs to have a good rap, but he needs to practice his rap. I'm a poet. I'm an amateur poet. My mother was a poet. My grandmother is a poet. My sister is the best poet in our family. Poetry is a part of us, and it's a part of hip-hop. It makes it beautiful. So, I think that the hip-hop generation has got a lot to offer. And the thing about the art form in the United States is it inspires all other areas of life. And the music is the most inspirational part. And so now you have some real strong hip-hop scholars who are inspired by hip-hop as a thought. So, I'm not alone. There are a number of us who actually respect hip-hop and work with hip-hoppers who are conscious.
You've been a teacher, a professor in San Francisco State. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell me more about that? Because you said you woke up in your second year of college?
Second year of law school.
Yes. How did you get to that point?
But for the Black Liberation Movement, I would have never been teaching at Black Studies Department because I had then majored in white studies. So what would I have known about Black studies? So literally, my re-education at the feet of masters, Garvey was my first, Malcolm X was my second. I met Malcolm in 1963. And others, that became the basis for my re-education. So San Francisco State had a strike in 1968 where black students struck. It was the first strike for black studies where they refused to attend classes. There was a little violence on campus, whatever. It took a number of months, and eventually it forced the administration to bring into being a college of black studies and also a college of ethnic studies, Asian American, Native American, Latino American, African American. And so I taught there from 1972 to 2013. I taught 16,000 students. The FBI tried to deny me tenure, which is what you call permanent teaching. They ran a counterintelligence program on me. They ran 3 to assassinate me and 1 to deny me a teaching credential, which I didn't fight. My spirit told me not to. I normally fight. The spirit said don't, and I didn't know why, but I followed the spirit. And then 3 years later, I have a job at San Francisco State. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Asa Hilliard is one of our great scholars in this country. He died a few years ago in Egypt. He was in charge of my hiring committee. And so we fought, and I won. And then from 1984 to 1996, I chaired the department, and we shifted the discipline from Black Studies, which was what the strike brought into being, which meant that African history was the centerpiece of the discipline. We shifted it to Africana studies, where African philosophy drove the discipline, with African history coming second, African linguistics along with it, and then we became the only department to bring in science, chemistry, physics, and biology from an African perspective into the discipline. And then there was a 2-year effort to wipe us out between 1990 and 92, and we defeated that. So this is still a very strong department. So for me, scholarship and activism have gone hand in hand, so it's been a good marriage. When the FBI was denying me tenure, I sought advice. Should I fight this? Some people told me, no, it's just a job. And then other people said, well, maybe you should. I sat down and listened to myself. I said, why are they trying to deny me tenure? Because a goal of the counterintelligence program, which is the program that killed King and Malcolm, was to separate activists from the youth. I said, well, I get paid to radicalize the youth. I can shut the door and do whatever I want to. So what I do in the first day of every class I taught is I close the door and I tell the students, the system was dumb enough to tenure me. I'm smart enough to radicalize you. I'm going to do everything I can to turn you into revolutionaries. And a lot of them would giggle. Some of it would be nervous. And I don't know who I influenced. I know in some cases, but in many cases, you don't know the influence you have. So that has been a positive experience. It enabled the system to pay me to fight it.
And is that when you started to write books?
No, I started writing books in core. At the end of core, I started writing my first book on Malcolm X. That I don't know how long it took for me to finish that book, but that was the beginning of my writing. And then while I was teaching, but I would write. It doesn't matter where I am, I'll write. So that became the basis for that. The book on Malcolm was the first book. And I was trying to let Malcolm speak for himself, because a lot of writers had distorted Malcolm's legacy. And I wanted to write a book that let Malcolm speak for himself and define where he was going with the Black Liberation Movement. He was my second master, meaning I studied indirectly under him, and in many ways, for a long time, I behaved like him. A lot of us did. My goatee, I wear a goatee because Malcolm did. I used to walk like Malcolm, talk like Malcolm. In fact, when I wrote the first draft of the political legacy of Malcolm X, Dr. Jacob Carruthers reviewed it, one of our great scholars, beautiful brother, and he said, I can't tell where Malcolm ends and you begin, which meant I needed to work further on the book, and I needed to separate myself from Malcolm, which took me a while to do, because he was a great man, and you love your master. And he was, for me, a master of character and of brilliance, and a master organizer. So that was my first book on Malcolm. You know.
And you've written more books?
2 books on the Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, that took 10 years to write. It's not on great Black leaders. It's on our leadership systems, traditions, philosophies, strategies, and practices. I'm a strategist, and I think next to loving God, the most important art is strategy. Strategy is the ultimate art. And you win or lose based on strategy. And so that's a part of what the art of leadership is about. So these two volumes are leadership. The fourth book I wrote is entitled Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. I thought that in leading the movement against the Bank of America for Jobs, the biggest bank in the world, it took 6 months to defeat the Bank of America for Jobs. I thought, and that was a statewide campaign fought in 14 cities in the state of California. Mm-hmm. I thought that that was the most difficult thing that I had done. Writing the Mother Principle was the most difficult thing. It took 14 disciplines to write. It came from a vision. The ancestors gave me an insight. The heart of that book is looking at the just societies of Africa. And I looked at 14 ancient African family systems that come before Islam or Christianity, because I wanted to find out what is the ideal family system for African people. Yeah. That's the key to empowering any people, is their family system. And so what I discovered was, contrary to popular belief, these family systems were not matriarchal. There may have been a few where African women ruled exclusively. They were not patriarchal. There may have been a few where men did. They were not matrilineal, where the last name comes from the mother, or patrilineal, even though we had family systems with either one or both of those systems. I came up with a new term. It was based on this vision that I received, and I call this not matrilineal, not patrilineal, twinlineal, meaning our lineage, we are descended from grandmothers and grandfathers, great-grandmother and great-grandfather, mother and father, twin lineage, meaning your lineage is twin, mother, father. And what I found in our family systems is empowerment was twin, meaning that the power in the family resided in both the male and the female, with women having lines of power and men having lines of power. And this goes back to the earliest family systems we created, which came out of the Twa, the world's first people, 144,000 years ago, where women were gatherers, men were hunters, and where decisions were made through consensus, and where there was no abuse of women or children or the elderly. These were the most just societies of the world, and it was from the Twa that ancient Kemet was founded. These were Anu people. So that's the Mother Principle. The fifth book is The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. This is a look at African American culture, but it starts off by looking at what are the forces that hit the African world since 1968, the globalization forces that have hit our families and our communities. And then it looks at how can African culture be used as an instrument for liberation. So the key focus is on how African, what I call new African culture, was reformulated in the Western Hemisphere, with a special look on the U.S. because it is the U.S. where people are most likely to argue that African culture was destroyed. It's hard to say that in the Caribbean and South America, where you're the majority on the land. But the fact is, a new African culture based on African principles was reformulated here. So that is the main focus of that book. And currently I'm working on a book that will serve as the basis for these leadership institutes called Paranks. That's the highest university system in ancient Egypt. It meant House of Life. And it's based on the secret societies of Africa and what these educational systems were based on. And I hope to have that finished by the end of this year, the beginning of next year. And that serves as a guideline for these leadership training institutes we'll be setting up in different parts of the African world.
All right, sounds very interesting. And where can we find these books? Where can we purchase these books?
These books can be found through obatshaka.com, OBATSHAKA.com. That's my website, and we have books available, or through Pan-African Publishers, which publishes these books. And we'll be bringing them to the Netherlands, to Rotterdam, when we come the end of May. My wife will be coming with me. You know, there's no way you can come on a trip like this. My wife said, I'm coming.
Yes.
She didn't say, can I come? She said, I'm coming.
I'm coming.
That's a woman.
No questions
The black
asked.
woman doesn't ask for any democracy. The black woman just tells you what she's going to do. So she'll be coming.
Well, that would
She
be fun.
born in Britain, but she's from Barbados. So she'll be going to Britain later to visit her son.
All right. But you'll be visiting us at the end of May.
Yes.
For a workshop, is that correct?
Yeah, one is on the 28th of May, and one is on the 29th of May. And one is a workshop, and one is a speech. The speech will be on the 28th of May, and that speech is dealing with clash of African civilization versus European civilization. We're going to be looking at the contrast between African cultural values and European cultural values, and how it's important that we draw from the best of African and African American and African Caribbean, African South American traditions to save the planet, because the planet is in danger now. It's not just white supremacy that threatens us. We're threatened with global warming. And that is due to a Western paradigm that is throwing the earth out of balance. And so we need to draw from a balanced paradigm. So this is a part of the 28th of May. The 29th of May is going to be a workshop for setting up a Perank. It's called Perank Amilcar Cabral Ella Baker Leadership Institute. These are leadership academies that we're setting up in different parts of the African world, where people run their own leadership training. But there's a component in here about free the mind, which is what I was talking about with my own experience, that we need to experience if we're going to have good leadership. And there's a component in here on mastery, how we create masters in different walks of life, which comes out of our traditions that come out of Africa. If you look at the Caribbean and South America, at the end of enslavement, Africans built almost everything they had. Where did they learn this? These were skills they carried from Africa, and they passed from mouth to ear to each other. And our best scholars in the United States, in the Caribbean, around the world, our best people, whatever their field is, they have usually come up under masters who have mastered whatever the art is, whether it's music, whether it's leadership, whether it's scholarship, whether it's a trade or profession, whether it's athletics. And so this is a part of what this Perank is based on, is this mastery system. So we'll be showing people how this works. And then there'll be ongoing training after that. And then there'll be training in specific leadership skills that people are interested in, such as how to set up businesses, how to set up independent black schools, and other things that people are interested in. So that'll be a nearly 5.5 hour workshop.
All right.
For that purpose.
And where can we
And then
apply?
from then on, you know, we'll be working with each other to continue that project. We'll be doing the same thing in the United Kingdom, where we've been working for the last 41 years. And we'll be doing that in different parts of the United States. The week before I come to Rotterdam, I'll be in a community outside of Detroit, Michigan, setting this up there. So this is, I figure at this time, my job is to help younger people with whatever they want to develop their skills. Y'all are in the forefront. I'll help do a little training, coach you a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there something else you would like to say? Maybe something we've missed?
Well, I just look forward to having a chance to come to the Netherlands, to Rotterdam, and to interact with African people there.
Yeah.
And see with your consciousness, I see you did your homework on this interview. You didn't just conduct an interview, you did your homework.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a lot of conscious Africans there as well. And I want to see them, and I just want to see our people and see what the condition is of our people in Rotterdam, and to hook up linkages so that we can have some Pan-African unity working between the U.S. and our brothers and sisters there. And I just want to convey the love that we have for you, all of you, and I know the feeling is mutual.
Yes.
So I look forward to
Looking
the exchange.
forward to meet you and your wife.
Yes. Pamela Hurley T'Shaka.
All right, then. Thank you for this interview.
Yeah, I enjoyed this.
Yes, I enjoyed it
Thank
as well. Well, looking forward then.
Okay. You'll
And
see us in a few weeks.
yes, hopefully it will go soon. Looking forward. All right, then I wish you a nice day.
Yeah, same to you.
Yes, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.